Beautiful prayer and meaningful prayer and kind of a meaningful song, anthem from our choir. Today is one of those days that if I had had my druthers, I would have turned back over and not gone to church. I have to be honest about it. I got here as late as I possibly could and still be respectably on time. I don't have a sermon. I don't intend to have a sermon. I have all kinds of thoughts. But I thought that knowing that a number of our people are away and traveling for one reason or another, all the way to the Indianapolis motorway to see the events down there, to northern countries, visiting cottages, that we might do a dialogue sermon. I've got a whole page of possibilities dealing with the concept of freedom, but I thought it would be fun if we do it together. This is the third of a series of sermons dealing with our congregational heritage. Faith, fellowship, and freedom are the cries of the Congregationalists from the times they arrived on the shores in this country until the present. 2 weeks ago, when we were dealing with the concept of faith, we tried to understand that faith caused us to ask the right questions, to probe our own existence, to understand God in our lives, to not give us something which is fed into us and said, "Here, this you must believe," but rather to say to us as we gather together as Congregationalists and as Christians, as seekers and followers of the way, how do we know the will of God in our lives, and how do we practice it together? And at that particular point, you will remember that we talked a great deal about the value of church, the value of checking out our thoughts with one another. We are all liars. Each one of us can con ourselves into almost anything. The tragedy of so much of the thought process is that if we don't have an outside source, we can firmly believe anything and find reasons for it that seem good and reasonable to us. Isn't that right? There is nothing more probing than somebody who lovingly asks and probes with you to find the right question. I've always been amused at debaters. Debaters are not searchers after truth, they're con artists. Ultimately, their point is that they can debate either side of the question to its highest point. And if they're good debaters, you never know what they believe. And the fact that good debaters can take almost any issue and present enough of an evidence around it to convince you when one's up and then the next shows you how easy it is for each of us, if we are working in that framework, to provide good and reasonable sources for our misunderstandings of life. And it's not an easy concept. The concept that we came with and we developed was that we gather together as checks on each other, expanding our horizons where they need to be expanded, closing them down where they need to be closed down, and keeping the preacher honest and each person in the pew honest. One of the tragedies of so many churches is that the preacher never hears anybody outside of himself criticize what he says. And they build that in. For 15 years, I've tried to get the congregational ministers of this area to talk about things other than church politics, which is a safe subject. Tried to say, listen, brothers, let's sit down and each one of us prepare a paper on where we stand and what we believe and why we believe it, and read it to each other for examination, discussion. It's a very good idea, Jim. We'll do that. Maybe next year's program chairman will take care of that. And now let's see, what's the other business on the agenda? 15 years. Because you see, it's easier to just spiel out from yourself and not have to stand. Well, I don't want to re-preach that sermon, so that's what we did. Now we talked about fellowship last week. Fellowship. And we continued on that particular theme of why we need each other and what the fellowship was all about and the openness and the happiness and what have you. And today we talk about freedom. As I began to put the sermon together, I chose the topics to fall this way. This is obviously the Sunday to preach about freedom. Don Winter has done an excellent job of raising why I wanted to talk about freedom in terms of the memorial. I suddenly began to realize, when I looked at the biblical record, do you realize that the word freedom is used one time in the entire Old Testament? Does that mean that the biblical record isn't interested in the concept of freedom? No. It's used 6 times in the entire New Testament. Does that mean that the early Christian church, that the teachings of Jesus, where Jesus never used the word freedom, were not interested in the concepts of freedom? Never. What it does mean is that there are certain concepts that you cannot explain. You live. And freedom is one of those concepts. I was in conversation with a friend who lives in a totally different area of the country. This individual has been going through tremendous upheavals in her own life. And as she's gone through the upheaval, she's gone from conference to conference to conference to conference to conference on how to communicate. For 3 years now, this young lady has been to every conference anywhere in the country that was talking about communication. And I can't quite get through to her that talking about communication is a way of avoiding it. Talking about love is a way of avoiding it. The modern emphasis of letting it all hang out and telling each other what you think is a means of avoiding true relationships and communication. And if you have to talk about freedom, you probably don't have it. Now that may come as a surprise to some. But I think it's more and more true that there are certain things in our lives that are so essential and such a part of us that if we can describe it, we've missed it. Because it's a living relationship. I've told you this about love. My familiar question of all young couples coming in to be married is why, when I was starting out, why do you love each other? Now, whether you've been married a week, a month, or 10 years, can you really answer that question? If you can, you probably got some things you have to work out. Because there's something there. That's why it's there. For an analytical mind to stand before you, for an individual who says over and over again, let's look at it, 1, 2, 3, to stand up and admit, man, I was wrong. There are aspects of life that happen that you cannot explain, they just happen. And if you can analyze them and explain them in the psychological laboratories or in any other way, you're missing the boat. This is a confession that I never expected to make, but I hold it to be true. And freedom is one of those areas. The people who are free don't talk about it. The people who are unfree are constantly talking about freedom. And so I ought to quit there. Except I wouldn't be doing my obligation to myself or to you. So, acknowledging that everything I say is growing out of my own lacks of freedom, I ask you to join in too, because there are areas to work on. Are you a free individual? Are you free within yourself to be what you want to be and how you want to be it? Are you free under God to make the kinds of choices that you want, or do you find that you have other things constantly tearing and balancing? You have a husband or a wife or children. You are not totally free because you have responsibilities. What's the balance between responsibilities and freedom? What's the balance between that which is within you and what society will either accept, tolerate, or recognize? How do you, as you grow over a period of years, find within yourself that healthy tension that does not mean that you have lost your ability to grow, but that you continue to grow in various concepts? Are you free to do things or free not to do things? Did you read in Ann Landers yesterday, a young boy in California writing in and saying to girls, please say no? The pressures of society on young people today is that you have to push to do something. The girls expect you're going to push and the boys expect, and they all talk about it. But he said it's so nice for a girl to say no because then the pressures are off and we can enjoy each other. Now that's an interesting letter. What that individual is asking and talking about is the freedom to be what he wants to be, but he doesn't know how to do it yet. He doesn't have the strength yet to do it on his own. He needs some help, but at least he's growing. Freedom Not to. Are you freedom from anxiety? Are you free from pressures? No, nobody is. I've never met an individual in my life that was free from pressures and anxiety. And when you are free from pressures and anxiety, you've lost all human contact. And you turn into withdrawing from everything, including yourself. What is peace? And how do we make it? What is the Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract, where my individual freedoms are constantly in touch and in tune and in conflict very often with your individual freedoms and the freedoms of a society? Who do I follow? Social pressure? Peer pressure? Church pressure? Do I follow myself or others? And how do I handle the tensions when I know something is right within me and yet all of the world cries out, no, that's wrong? It's not easy questions, are they? And yet each one of us faces it every day. We face it in our businesses where decisions are being made that we ourselves may not make. Do we follow them through because a superior officer in the company has said, this is what you will do? Or do you raise questions about them because as a moral individual you must stand up and be counted? Do you take as an excuse from your children or from yourself, everybody does it, and therefore it's okay to do? It may not be right, but then everybody's doing it. It's a fascinating kind of a thing. Listen to people justifying the legal but shoddy tactics in which a whole range of things going on. And ultimately it comes down to everybody is doing it. Most of the social programs that are under such fire today for being inadequate are inadequate not because they aren't helping the people that are expected to be helped, but because the programs are being ripped off by people too clever and too sharp and too smart, and who have the power to rip it off because they know how to manipulate it. We talk about socialized medicine, but you've never seen a client arrested for ripping off the government. But you have all kinds of doctors who are being investigated. And we can go right on down the line. And the answer always is everybody is doing it. Where does the freedom of the individual end in terms of the freedom of the society? Well, I've got the questions. Anybody got some answers? Good Lord. See what happens when you get me pricked from behind here a little bit? It's interesting. All right. I see I got you all now. If you talk about it, then you haven't got it, so nobody's going to say anything. Okay, let me just pick up on it. The Old Testament in particular, in spite of the fact that it uses the word freedom one time, is a book completely and totally dedicated to the concepts of freedom. From the very beginning, man is a free creature, a free creation under God, according to the stories that are told in the opening parts of Genesis. He has reaction. And basically, if you look at it from a theological point of view, which is rather interesting, in the Old Testament you find that, and it carries through into the New Testament, the biblical record, you find that there are three things that they talk about. The first is a personal, practical freedom, the freedom of self-expression, in order to shape and make decisions that affect one's life. The second is ethical freedom, and the third is religious freedom. Let's back up and let me just talk for a couple of minutes about each of those, okay? And maybe stimulate your dining room conversation today and dinner conversation after church. And then get back to me. Let me know how you feel about it. In the first place, there has to be personal freedom. The biblical record is full of it. Now, this is not to deny that there isn't slavery. There has always been slavery of one kind or another in the world. It's one of the tragedies of man that he somehow or another finds his own self-esteem by the destroying of others. The dictator is an extremely weak individual. He is so weak he dares not be contradicted. It is a sign of a vital, flowing society that one can stand up and be counted. that one is open to the criticisms of others. We had the opportunity Friday night of seeing All the King's Men. Well, that's called All the President's Men, I think, wasn't it? I went to that movie expecting not to like it. I went in with a very negative attitude. I would say it's probably one of the best movies Hollywood has ever produced. If you have not seen it, please go see it. It's a very dramatic statement which, if you look at it from one side, shows how evil democracy can be, but if you see it from the other side, shows the positive correctives of a democratic system that permits free examination of ideas and, in fact, demands them. I do not see it as being anti any party or anti any individual. I do see it as a self-examination. And approached that way, it's an exciting movie. You see, because there is to be found, both within our democratic situation and also within the biblical record, the need for the human being to expand his horizons to take in even those who disagree in loving fellowship. There is the need for individuals to have the power to make decisions over their lives. Power so that they themselves have a right to move freely from place to place. They have the right to move freely within the social structures. They have the right to do what they themselves must do without undue pressure from others. And the real slavery is not the kind of slavery found very often in the old world, but the kind of slavery found in a society that pledges the rights but doesn't permit them. And so part of the biblical record is a cry for individual freedom. The freedom that I as an individual can stand before you and anybody in the world and say, this I believe for these reasons. Now the problem is, of course, that oftentimes individual freedom becomes, as Paul says in the opening part, and as Don Winter mentioned, but you ought to read, or not Paul, but Peter up here. Freedom too often in today's world is nothing more than a pretext for evil. There are those who cry out for personal freedom whose very cry is nothing more than a means of enabling them to continue the evil paths that they and all of society know to be wrong. The permissiveness of American society is not that it's wrong to be permissive, but it is wrong to establish no standards of justice for anything. You've got friends, I've got friends who utilize the concept of personal freedom to do the most degrading things that they possibly can do, both to themselves and to others, in the name of precious freedom. Right? Say amen. Of course you do. You see it all the time. You see people standing up on the stages of the talk shows of America spouting out stuff that is not only uninteresting, but sheer garbage in the name of personal freedom. When a stripper suddenly stands up and talks about her relationships to John Kennedy and makes little of it, but makes sure that all the television stations know about it, in the name of personal freedom, one is suspecting what is behind the motivation. What's happening? Where there is no responsibility, where there is no responsibility of what you say, where there's no responsibility of what you do in an American society that suddenly says anything's all right as long as it's done in the name of freedom. God help us. We need to help ourselves, for there is a need of the responsibility of actions. And this raises the second point, which is extremely important in the biblical record. Ethical freedom in the biblical record is this, that you know what is right and what is wrong. And you are free to choose that which is right and eschew that which is wrong. But if you choose that which is wrong or neglect that which is right, you must bear the consequences. Now that's the difference. You must bear the consequences. You see, we hear the cry so often now, choose whatever you want. You're free to choose. And then when the consequences go wrong, you say, well, it's not my fault. I didn't have control over it. One of the things that I fought on campus back in the days of the rebels on campus, where I was a target for much of their maliciousness because they didn't like the fact that I always tried to hold a standard of judgment to their actions, was this. What's wrong with you guys? You storm in, tear up a place, burn it up, make a mess of it, We saw it on Wayne's campus all the time. And then the first thing you say when discussion is going on is, don't hold us accountable for what we did. Give us a blanket freedom. No prosecution. No worries about our grades. No worries about anything else. We don't want to be held accountable for the garbage mess we just caused. Remember those things? That's the first thing out of the bag. Every criminal, when he's arrested, is not guilty because of social functions, parents didn't do something right, bad education. Where is the individual responsibility when one makes an ethical and moral choice? Where is the ability to stand up and say I was wrong and therefore I have to begin to make a different kind of movement? I remember one time walking into the president of Wayne State University's office, and it was being held by a group of radical young students at that particular point who had been there for 2 days, and nobody had done anything except throw milk cartons and beer cans and all kinds of things around. And I knew the president that was leading this particular rebellion, who was standing up on a table, beautiful table, scratching it all up, and I walked in and the elevator door opened, and I stepped out, and I knew this guy, and I looked around and I said, my God, you guys must not have any respect for yourself at all. And he stopped his tirade, and he said, what do you mean? I said, no self-respecting person presents this kind of an image to the world. And he stepped down off the table, and he said, brothers and sisters, clean this place up. And I came back a half hour, and it was immaculate. And he said, thank you. And they went in at that point with a total different attitude. And within an hour, the thing was worked out. After 2 days. You see, there is a responsibility and a responsibility of ethical choice and presentation that is so important that if you miss it, you're not even talking to each other anymore. So the biblical record says you have a freedom, but you have to accept the responsibility for the freedom. And that freedom ultimately of ethics comes down to a freedom of religion. This is a society which does not hold religion to be very important. The reason is that religion isn't very important. Which one of you, when you have a major decision to make, really sits down and talks about it and prays about it and tries to find the ethical way to do it on the basis of principles? After 6 weeks of doing nothing more than trying to probe with individuals the principles of their lives on the People's Show, I've come to the conclusion that the vast majority of people in the world never ask that question, upon what principle am I making this decision? Can't get them to do it. Doesn't matter whether they're social workers, they're doctors, or professional social people of one kind or another, or who they are, they basically can't do it. The only person that did was the woman that was on the show today. A black woman, 7th grade education, 6th grade education, turned on to the fundamentalist church who could answer every single question with an understanding of why she did it, whether you agreed with that reason or not, and I didn't 90% of the time. She at least knew why she was doing things. But for the vast majority, people don't use religion in that sense. Religion is a means by which you organize your thoughts to feel good and then don't have to change anything. Religion is a means of stamping upon us in America's society the approval of some organization. Religion has not been what it was in the Bible, a means to reach down into the core of every one of us and grab there till it hurts and to say under God, why do you do what you're doing? That's what religion is really about. That's that kind of absolute agony that one makes over decisions until he knows well within himself that he is making a decision not on the basis of whether it's going to better him or not, whether it's going to have this effect and manipulate somebody else or not, whether it's going to be his, but making it upon the idea that this is the right thing for me to do. Quoting Martin Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That's the religious freedom that's being talked about in the biblical record. That's the ethical freedom that's talked about under God, where you search and stand up to be counted. And that ultimately is the personal freedom. Because one can only be personally free when one is responsive to the desires and needs of others. One can only be personally free when one reaches out and at times willingly gives up what he himself may desire for a good that he knows to be true. One can only be personally free when one stands and sees the results of his actions. Let me just make that very, very simply personal for a moment. As you look at the frustrations of your lives, one of the most frustrating things that all of us face who work and talk and share with people is we never know what's happening. You see, it's nice for an artist when he paints, he can see his results. It's nice for a mechanic when he's through, the car runs well. It's nice for the woodworker when he's finished, he's got a product that he can feel and touch. But most of life doesn't show us that. You never know whether the kids you've poured so much into are going to make it or not. You never know that the conversation you had with an individual helped or not. You never know that the passing ships, the smile that you gave because it felt the thing to do, changed that person's outlook for that day or not. And you're seldom told. Oftentimes, when you touch to the very core of a person's existence, they are almost embarrassed to tell you what it meant, and really can't. And there are times when nothing more than a thank you communicates it all. You see, a week ago in one of the interviews, I asked an individual who worked in a soup kitchen, "Why do you do this? Has anybody ever changed for the years you put into it? Have any of the derelicts been different? Have any of the people had any change in their lives whatsoever towards you?" He said, "Not that I could document." I said, "Then why do you do it?" He said, "Because I see in each human being that bit of God to which I must respond." That's freedom. That's ethical. That's moral. That's religious. That's human. And ultimately, we can't talk about it. We can only do it. Be free, one with another, with yourself. But be responsible for what you do.